Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, it's a pleasure being here this afternoon. My name is John Simmons, and I work for the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council. We have provided written testimony from RIPEC as well as the Rhode Island Business Coalition in regards to several of the bills. And if you do not mind, Chairman, I would like to be able to speak on all the minimum wage bills at once, so as opposed to coming back separately. First, if I may, we would be in opposition to all but S bill, I think it's 238, which is the study committee on the minimum wage. What I'd like to be able to say first, Mr. Chairman, is that raising the 960 to the 1050 is a 9%. You're going to hear some of the same statistics that you may have heard, but I'll try to be quick through them. It's a 9% increase in the compensation on the minimum wage. One looks at it, if it's done in October or July, this would be about the fourth or fifth time in as many years. The amount for that increase is roughly 40%, almost 41% increase in the minimum wage over the last 4 or 5 years, which is much higher than mostly any other income growth within about any category that one can look at. With that in mind, you've heard a lot about the literature in regards to the minimum wage. And what I'd like to be able to do, just to sort of summarize what we have seen in the literature, and for Senator De Palma's purposes, I'll have for him tomorrow the documents that we use as our literature review. We use actually the Federal Reserve System and the Congressional Budget Office for our work. We don't go to the advocates or the advocates in the sense of either side for the work. But we have found from many of the Federal Reserve analysis of minimum wage that there are several points which occurs on the negative impact on the raising of the minimum wage almost at any dollar amount. The larger, the more the consequence of it. For instance, the bill that raises to the $15 has the most severe consequence as opposed to raising it on smaller amounts. And what was found in most of these studies, there is a rising in consumer price, there's a reduction in creation of new jobs, there is a decreased rate of proprietorship, there's an increased rate of firm death, there is an increased exit of labor-intensive firms combined with increased entrance of capital-intensive firms, which could lead to long-term disemployment effect, low-skilled labor effectively replaced with technology. And we have found that there is an impact on low-wage jobs when one looks at the impact of minimum wage over time in a variety of locations, and this is in accordance with the Federal Reserve report, including one out of Boston and several others. Now we go look at what is the cost of this in a sense. When one looks at, according to the Department of Labor and Training, there are 78,000 individuals that make less than the $10.60 per hour. There's nearly 40,000 that are at the 960. So if one looks at the number, and I will use for the sake of discussion a number that was thrown out by George Nee, about $1,072 per person. If you take it times 40,000 people, you're talking about $43 to $42 million cost for the employers within the state for the minimum wage that you're proposing. There is a real cost to the employers for this minimum wage. That does not take into consideration any employer costs, FICA, etc., off of that 42, 43. Our number is significantly higher when one looks at others. If you do a 30-hour at the 90 cents, you're almost talking about $52 million cost for the employers within the state if you adhere just to the 960 to 1050 and not the other. And if one looks at that amount, it doesn't take into consideration, as FICA. It does not take into consideration the ripple effect, and it's a terminology. It means if I raise the base, what is the cost that if I move up that base throughout the entire organization? What do I do with the supervisors of those who are under minimum wage? Do I not raise their pay? So our cost is relatively minor compared to what we think will be the full impact on the economics for businesses. Next is who actually is the most adversely impacted by the minimum wage. And you've heard there are about 3 industrial sectors. One is the accommodations and food service, the healthcare and social assistance, and retail trade. Those are the 3, according to many of the studies, will be the most adversely impacted by raising the minimum wage. Now, for Rhode Island, what does that mean? Of course, the largest industry within the state is healthcare, and it is the 3rd fastest growing. If you look at accommodations and food service, it's the 2nd largest and fastest growing within Rhode Island. Then you look at retail trade, it's the 3rd largest with the 10th fastest. One of the items that we have found when we look at the impact of jobs is the economy around it. And it is hard to determine, because of the increase that you have on the pressure for pay, that the minimum wage may not have the dramatic impact that has been originally told by the CBO and others, but rather it's about opportunity lost and cost. The next is the cost of raising may be disproportionately borne by smaller employers, small businesses. Over 90% of Rhode Island firms have fewer than 20 employees, and this is according to DLT material as of March of 16. Small businesses tend to pay lower wages than larger firms, so likely have a larger share of lower income employees. Small businesses less likely have cash reserve or access to capital means to greater difficulty absorbing these increased costs. Again, this is an issue that is based purely on one item, and that's liquidity, or say elasticity. Where those companies have elastic ability to hire and pay more wages and not have a price sensitivity or hours, will be less impact. But if the firm is small and it's in one of those areas that have low margin, they will be most adversely impacted. One must look at now also the cost of raising it, again, on how we'll compare ourselves with others. We have, again, the numbers you've heard will be the 10th highest now. We'll be either the second highest in New England, the third highest in the country if we go to this high rate of income. One of the things that we look at is what is the cost of living in Rhode Island versus Connecticut and Massachusetts. What is the wage rates within Massachusetts and Connecticut? When one looks at the cost of living, there are higher cost of livings in Massachusetts and Connecticut than there is in Rhode Island. The wage adjustments, for instance, in Massachusetts, the average wage is higher than ours in Rhode Island. Our minimum wage is closer to our average wage than the average wage in Massachusetts or Connecticut. So we would be moving the base up higher in Rhode Island compared to the average wage of everyone else within the state, higher than what Connecticut and Massachusetts are doing. And again, once one looks at that, this what is then is the cross-border issue we talked about would be is one of the issues if we raise it here higher or similar to Mass. Will people flock here to work in Rhode Island, or will they flock to Massachusetts at a higher amount? If that's the case, then we would have a much more difficult time of hiring people here in Rhode Island, which we do not seem to be in those wage areas that we're talking about for competitive nature. Also, we must take into consideration the climate. Again, I would just be very briefly, we have one of the worst business climates within the state. You raise the cost of doing business. We have one of the highest costs of doing business in the state. This will raise it anywhere, if one looks at $40 to $50 million per year for employers within the state. And then finally, what I'd like to say is, I've heard a lot about this as a social policy issue. And what our concern is that you are asking the employer community to resolve social issues. And we do not believe that that is a fundamental issue before private employers to solve the state's social issues. If you want to look at how you get better money into individuals, there's an approach called from tax credits. There are other areas to which the state can sponsor it and support it, as opposed to asking a private employer to take a risk to pay people higher amounts. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield to any questions.